In this lecture, we're going to talk about imperialism during the 19th century and how those empire-creating states are going to continue to grow the size of their empires throughout the 19th century. Now, in the previous era, we talked about colonizing powers, and now we're talking about imperializing power. So we want to make sure we have an understanding of the difference between colony and empire, or the move to find colonies versus the move to develop empires. There is some overlap here, okay? And we're still going to talk about some colonial holdings even in the 19th century. But generally speaking, when we talked about the earliest colonies in the last era, whether it was Britain and France or the Dutch coming to North America or Latin America for the Spanish and the Portuguese, colonies tended to be the drive to create an immigrant population from your mother country to a new land. And these colonies would tend to abide by the laws and customs of the mother country. Now, of course, there are aspects of economic control of these areas, but they tended to have locals from the mother countries move to and settle into the colonies to control the colonies as if they were just a portion of the mother country, to control them as in many of the same ways with the same rules and regulations from the mother country. Whereas empire, as we're going to see in the 19th century, tends to be more focused on monetary goals or military goals. More so even on the monetary, though, rather than a new place to settle your populations. Populations would resettle, but that wasn't the expressed goal. And the primary workforce in these empires now is going to be local populations. Local populations, rather than immigrants or settlers coming from the mother country. So we know that there are already states, starting with in the late 1500s, early 1600s, there are already European powers that were engaged in creating overseas holdings. And what countries do we think of when we think of European powers that are moving to create overseas holdings? Great Britain probably sticks forefront in our mind. France, sure. Portugal in Latin America, and in Brazil, Spain in Latin America, definitely. So these powers are still going to remain and still attempt to hold on, but some of them are going to expand their control, and that's where we want to talk about Britain first. So we're going to talk about Britain first, and we're going to look to India. Now, Britain had been in India in the 18th century, the 1700s. But by the mid-1700s, a war will be fought between Britain and France that's known as the 7 Years' War. Some like to consider this the First World War because Britain and France were not only fighting on the European continent in the 7 Years' War, they were also fighting in South Asia over their Indian holdings and control and domination of India. They were also fighting in the Americas. And the American version of the 7 Years' War we call what? It's the French and Indian War. Very good. So the British victory over France in the 7 Years' War is going to cement British control and domination of the Indian subcontinent. Now, this is originally done through that British East India Company. If you guys recall, these corporations, these joint stock companies, like the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company, not only would they be attempting to control, or they would be attempting to control the economic well-being of their company. They were not only trying to become a stronger company financially, but they used military to do that. So the company's ships were armed with guns. The companies had soldiers, all right? So it was through the British East India Company that British control would expand in India. And as the Mughal dynasty, as the Mughal Empire declined in the late 19th or late 18th century, Britain is going to expand its control. Now, this kind of crazy map here with all kinds of colors going on in here, we can see this continuing expansion of Britain. So this dark red stuff we see here, that's British control by 1805. And you can see a lot of it is relegated to the coastlines of India. But then as we push by the mid-1850s, they've now taken over much of this northern area of the Bay of Bengal. They've taken over in the region known as the Punjab. And then there's other areas that are going to be dependent Indian states by the early 1900s, which means the British are going to be controlling it, but through local Indian rulers. So ultimately, by the early 20th century, Britain is going to be in complete control of India. And this British control of India is known as the British Raj, R-A-J. So if you hear or see the British Raj, just know that that is the term used for the British Empire in India, the British government in India. Now, here's the problem with India. What do you think has long been the difficulty of people like the British or the French before them controlling India, or the Portuguese controlling India? Why is this such a tough nut to crack? Yes, sir?
Maybe because of their religion.
Okay, there's a different religion. So maybe the Hindus and the Muslims of India wouldn't be welcoming to these Christian British or French? Yes, ma'am? Okay, India is a massive peninsula, and maybe they've got a lot of water protection, but as navies grow, that's going to start to limit that. But what does India have that is virtually unparalleled by any other nation except for China, possibly? Yes, ma'am? They've got a lot of people. Okay, hundreds of millions of people. All right, at this time, we're talking about 300 million Indians. So India's got a lot of people in the Indian subcontinent as a whole. India's got a lot of people, and it was always hard for these European powers that would be dominating other parts of the world. Like, for example, how does Spain take over Latin America while Britain can't, by the early 1800s, take over India? What happens to the population of Latin Americans? Yeah, they're going to die because of the European diseases that are foreign to them. While India is a part of the old world, they're not going to be dying because of old world diseases because they'd already been in contact with them. So for Britain to control India, they can't do it with just Britons. Okay, B-R-I-T-O-N-S, British people. They can't do it with just British people. So they're going to start to employ and use local Indians as soldiers and as administrators to the British Empire. And these people are going to be known as sepoys. S-E-P-O-Y. Sepoy. These are Indians that are essentially working for the British, often as soldiers, in the British administration of India. S-E-P-O-Y. But we want to have a recognition that what is going to happen here in the British Raj is eventually going to be replicated in other imperial holdings around the world by the 20th century. Eventually, colonized or imperialized people don't want to be imperialized anymore. They would much prefer local control and what we would call autonomy, being able to rule yourself, rather than having a British Empire rule you. Even if, when we're going to discuss other imperial powers, like if we were to compare the British Empire to the French Empire to the Belgians who are going to create a small empire in Africa, if we're going to compare how any of those nations ruled their empires, comparatively speaking, the British were like the best. The British allowed the most local autonomy. The British allowed the most local rule and allowed local people to have some say over their or over their holdings or over their empire. The French were pretty harsh. The Belgians were despicable in their rule of the Belgian Congo. But even with the British allowing some local Indians to have a say and have some control in the rule of the British Raj, there are still going to be problems that are going to develop. And the Sepoy Rebellion that will develop in 1857 is one example of those problems. So the Sepoy are these Indians working essentially for the British. Well, by 1857, the Sepoys are going to revolt, and this revolt grows out of protestations from the British and their practice of using grease that is at times derived from pork fat or beef fat in the greasing of the gun cartridges. You know, a gun cartridge is just a cartridge that's going to hold a few bullets that you stick up into a rifle, right? Well, these have to be greased so the metal parts continue to move. Well, the British are going to use fat from animals, like pork, like pigs, or like cows, to grease these cartridges. Why would that be problematic for these sepoy? Yes, ma'am. Okay, so, for example, so the Hindus might have a problem with the use of beef fat, for example, in the grease in the cartridges. Well, then what about Muslim Indians? They should be fine with that, right? The pork, the prohibition that the pork is haram, it's forbidden. And so as the sepoy had to use this British-provided cartridges, this caused some issues. So it was a lack of understanding. Even though the British are probably going to be more forward-thinking than any other imperial power with allowing the local people to have some say in the control of the government, there's still going to be this recognition that the British don't truly understand or recognize the culture they're dealing with. Now, that being said, in 1857, the Sepoy Rebellion comes, and it will be suppressed by the British. The British will put it down. The British will defeat the Sepoy Rebellion. And following this, they will assert more control over the British Raj, over British India. And in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, Britain will take more complete control over the Indian subcontinent, allowing Indian raw materials, especially cotton. Remember the American Civil War and how American cotton is going to stop flowing as quickly to Britain, to those textiles that the British industry needs. And now it's going to come from India. And then it gives them a massive market with hundreds of millions of people that they can sell finished products to. Upper castes in India will be used and educated in a British style so they can administer the British government. Christianity is going to spread in India as Christian missionaries work their way through the subcontinent. British industry is going to build railroads and construct canals throughout the Indian subcontinent. By the time we get to the First World War, the British Raj is administering an entire subcontinent of India with hundreds of millions of Indians, with about 4,000 white British officials. All right? So this is a pretty effectively run colony, in part using local administrators to oversee local issues. Yes, sir?
You're saying they use the local populations to build canals?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Well, that could be a problem.
Yeah, well,
because that's what happened in China.
Yeah.
Because conscripted labor, there's going to be a problem.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this wouldn't be slave labor, though, at the time. This wouldn't be, there would be pay for work. It would be horrible work, but there would be pay for work. Another power that we should mention is Indonesia. Indonesia was an early colonizing power the Dutch were an early colonizing power in Indonesia. Yeah, my bad. The Dutch were an early colonizing power in Indonesia, and they will only expand their holdings in Indonesia as we push into the 19th century. The Dutch cleverly, and here, see the island of Java down here? It's the most populous of the Indonesian islands, along with Sumatra to the north of it. The Indonesians would originally be colonized by the Dutch, and the Dutch would start to make some footholds in Java, and the Dutch had access to guns. So local Indonesians, when they're having little rivalries with other Indonesians, we have to remember this too, because the old ugly American idea is we would look at this part of the world and we would think everybody's the same. When in reality, if we were to zoom that microscope in, even on the island of Java, you've got all kinds of different people with all kinds of different practices, different languages, not identical to each other. So there would be local rivalries, right? And as the Dutch would enter into Java, they would begin to support. I'm going to pick this prince and support him, all right? And we will help him out, and we will offer some military aid. We'll get him some guns so that prince can win his little war against his rivals. And what do the Dutch want in turn? Just give us a little bit of land. Just give us control of this land so we can start to exploit it economically. And that prince who they helped win was more than happy to do that. But then as time would press on, there would be other conflicts, and the Dutch would put their weight behind other local princes and wars. And by the end of it, by the time we get to 1800, the Dutch are in complete control of Java. And ultimately, by the end of the 1800s, in complete control of almost all of Indonesia. And eventually, those Indonesians themselves are starting to look at the Dutch and saying, wait a minute, we want to push you out now. And they're not able to do it. It ultimately wouldn't be until the Japanese come in and drive out the Dutch. So European states are going to create massive overseas empires. And it's not just the British and it's not just the Dutch. The French in the late 19th century are going to enter into and conquer Southeast Asia. This is the French, yep. This is what is today the nation of Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. The French are going to take over Southeast Asia, and this is going to become a French holding called French Indochina that they will rule until the 1950s. The United States are going to get... That's it, Tyler, I'm sorry. That's it. I'm sorry. There's more to come later in the year. The United States are going to get involved in the imperial game. You guys probably remember this discussion from AP US History. The United States are going to get involved in the imperial game. First, in wanting to gain holdings in the Pacific, like in Hawaii. Two reasons why the United States is going to want holdings in the Pacific. One, military bases. Because now ships in the 19th century are not being propelled merely by wind. They're being propelled by what? Steam, which is being created by what? Coal. Very good. The coal boils the water makes the steam turns the turbines, which makes the ship go forward, right? But now that you're burning coal, what must you have sprinkled throughout the Pacific Ocean? Because that ocean is so big.
Ports.
Ports to refuel, to bring new coal onto your ships. Yes, sir.
Does this have to do anything with last year? In APUS, people told me about the Manifest Destiny. Does this still carry on?
Manifest Destiny was the 19th century belief that the United States should push from coast to coast. It should stretch all the way to the Pacific. This is kind of an extension now, I guess, on to Manifest Destiny. But I think Manifest Destiny, the destiny is sealed when the United States makes it to the Pacific. Now this is American imperialism. Essentially, it's America saying, hey, we're a world power too. We want to do what the British are doing. And we start, for example, by getting involved in Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Hawaii gives a midway access point access to Japan, for example, or to East Asia, and so it can be used as a refueling port. There's also business interests that are going to get us involved in Hawaii. American corporations setting up planting operations. You guys familiar with a guy named Dole? He's gonna produce a lot of pineapples, right? So American business interests and American military interests are going to align in the creation of an overseas American empire. And then in 1898, the United States is going to have a war with Spain. Right? Late 1800s, we're going to fight a war with Spain called the Spanish-American War. And American victory in that war is going to give the United States other holdings, like the Philippines, and Guam, and Puerto Rico, in the Caribbean. So the United States is getting involved in creating an overseas empire. We're going to see the expansion of a Russian empire in the 19th century. A Russian empire that had always been big is going to continue to expand, and I like this map because we can see, even though you can't really make up the delineation of the colors, but in 1533, this is like post-Ivan the Terrible time. In 1533, we've got a large Russia by other standards in Europe, but it's nothing to what it is going to one day become. And then by 1689, this is after the reign of Peter the Great, now we've got a Russia that stretches all the way across Siberia, right? And pushes further to the south. 1689 to 1801, Russia takes over Ottoman lands and gets to the Black Sea. And then eventually, I'm going to fast forward all the way down here, 1855 to 1881, the time period that we're dealing with now, Russia is going to push deeper into the region of China, or a region formerly controlled by China called Manchuria. And as the Chinese dynasty is going to weaken. So we're going to have an expanding Russian empire. We're going to have Spain and Portugal. We're going to see their influence actually decline. All right? Spanish influence and Portuguese influence is going to decline. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more in a couple days about the revolutions that are going to be stemming up during this time period. But we're going to see some colonies, like ourselves in the United States, and particularly the Spanish holdings in Brazil and Portuguese holdings in Latin America, they're going to gain independence through revolution. And you can see on this map, we got Mexico in 1821, and Colombia in 1819, Venezuela in 1830, Brazil in 1822. In the early 19th century, most of the holdings of Spain and Portugal are going to be lost in the Americas. So at the same time that other empires are expanding their influence, Spain is going to be on the decline. Spain is going to be on the decline. We'll talk about reasons for that in a couple days. All right. In this standard, we also need to make mention of how diplomacy and warfare will be used to create these empires, particularly in Africa. Now, the word diplomacy, first two letters there, D-I, right? That means what? Two. So diplomacy and diplomatic relations usually involves nations talking to each other. When we practice diplomacy, we are like encouraging our leaders to talk to the leaders of other nations to work out deals, right? When diplomacy doesn't work, we often see war, right? In fact, some have referred to warfare as diplomacy by other means, but we won't need to worry about that today. In 1884, German Chancellor, a guy named Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck. You see his cartoon right here. German Chancellor in 1884 is going to invite European leaders to the city of Berlin in Germany to resolve conflicts over African claims. You've got all these European countries that are trying to stick their fork into Africa, and they will meet in Berlin in 1884 to lay out the ground rules of how colonies can be claimed, how territories can be claimed, how empire can be claimed in Africa. This is known as the Berlin Conference in 1884, the Berlin Conference. And rules will be established for how Africa can be divided up. And in the couple decades after the Berlin Conference, virtually all of the African continent will be completely taken over by European powers. Except for two exceptions. In West Africa, anyone know what this nation is? Yes. Liberia, very good. That was that nation that was founded by the former slaves of the United States, right? James Monroe, very good. I mean, actually, the capital of Liberia is? Monroeville, very good. And so Liberia here in the west, and what is this country in the east? Brandon? Sudan. It's not the Sudan. Fifi. That is Ethiopia, very good. Also known as Abyssinia to history. You guys don't need to concern yourselves with that today. Very good. We'll talk about that. Oh, excellent, excellent. So this is the nation of Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a long-lasting kingdom that repelled outsiders until the late 19th century, or actually until the early 20th century. The Italians tried to take over Ethiopia in the late 1800s, and they were defeated by local Ethiopian armies. What's different about Ethiopia compared to the nations surrounding it is this remained a Christian kingdom. And as that remained a Christian kingdom, Christian powers in Europe were a little slower to try to push into it and take it over. Non-Christian kingdoms, they were perfectly comfortable dominating. Yes?
So isn't Liberia a United States?
No, it was not. It's not a United States colony. It was support. It looks kind of like us, but it was not a United States colony. But it was largely founded and settled by returning American slaves. Yes?
Since like France and Britain and like Spain, did most of these countries eventually become Christian?
Yes, Christian missionaries were heavy at work in many of these places, but I wouldn't say most of them became Christian. For example, in places where Islam had already penetrated, it was much harder to convert these Muslim populations to Christianity. You are much more likely to see places that were not touched by Islam become strong Christian holdings. But in places like, for example, French Algeria would stay Muslim throughout. Egypt, even with British influence, would stay Islamic. Yes?
Which one of, like, which area, I guess, was one of the first to be, like, independence to start developing?
In Africa, you're going to have early independence movements in Kenya. Like, it was the British colonies first. The British colonies first. But anyway, so we're going to have pretty much all of Africa taken over and colonized by European powers, except for Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and Liberia. The problem is the lines that these people drew, the lines that the Europeans worked out and agreed to, are odd. Like, they make no sense. For example, look at the line between Egypt and Sudan. Look at the line between the French colony of Algeria and the other French colonies in the Saharan and in the Eastern Sahara, or in the Western Sahara. These are lines that you can tell are drawn by people with maps and rulers and compasses, right? They're not necessarily drawn because of local populations and local issues. And so this is going to be a problem that Africa is going to be still dealing with today, the remnants of this imperial age, when Europeans were drawing their imperial boundaries based on European diplomacy, based on European needs or European concerns, not based on the needs or the desires of local populations. Yes?
What about the Dutch here? I thought the Dutch went to South Africa.
The Dutch were in South Africa, but by the late 19th century, they're going to be out of there, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. In fact, we'll talk about that in about 30 seconds. One colony in Africa that's kind of unique compared to the rest that I want to mention is this big one in the middle. It's the only holding that Belgium has. This is the Belgian Congo. This is the Belgian Congo. The Belgian Congo is an interesting story that I hope you guys look into more in the future than we can in an AP World class. But the Belgian Congo is the story of one king, a guy named Leopold II, Belgian King Leopold II, who wanted to have an empire like other European powers were creating empires.
His daughter, though? His daughter wanted a colony.
Well, but okay, he might claim it's for his daughter, but it's for him. Belgium is going to make a plea to other colonial powers to give them this part of the Congo. And the other colonial powers are going to relent, and they're going to allow Belgium to enter in to control the Belgian Congo. And the Belgians and their rule in the Congo is going to be particularly brutal and particularly harsh. I believe we looked at a photo the other day of Congolese in the Belgian Congo who have had their hands severed because they didn't meet their rubber quotas of the production that they were supposed to meet. And the Belgian rule in the Congo is going to be horribly harsh. And it shouldn't surprise us that today some of the biggest issues in Africa are in the areas that were once colonized by the Belgians. You guys might have heard of a genocide in the nation of Rwanda in the 1890s. Rwanda was a part once of the former Belgian rule. And remnants of the issues that the Belgians created ultimately lead to genocide in the 1990s. Yeah?
So, for example, my dad used to work with this one person who, like, is from Rwanda.
Yeah.
So, like, it's still, like, the remnants of it is still there because, like, even my parents, they were, like, it's crazy because, like, he has all his family that.
Absolutely, absolutely. In South Africa, the British are ultimately going to take control in South Africa. Now, the southern tip of Africa was originally colonized by the Dutch. All right? The Dutch took over, and after the Portuguese were there first, the Dutch will eventually move in. The Dutch start to create a settler colony in South Africa.
Wait, you said British take control of South Africa?
The British will eventually control it from the Dutch. In 1795, the British will seize Cape Town, the most major city on the coast there. The British will seize Cape Town and begin to bring British settlers into South Africa. In the late 19th century, diamond mines are found. When diamonds begin to be exploited in South Africa, the British want even more control of the region. They want to dominate the entire southern tip of Africa. This will cause a conflict between the British subjects in South Africa and the former Dutch subjects in South Africa, who we now are going to refer to as Boers, B-O-E-R-S. And in the late 1800s, a war will develop between the British government and these Dutch subjects in South Africa called Boers, and the British refer to this as the Boer War. It's just another conflict by the British Empire to assert dominance over another corner of the world. Britain was victorious, and South Africa would become a part of the British Empire. And you notice what Britain has created for themselves. A nearly unbroken chain of colonies, of empire, from Egypt in the north of Africa all the way down to South Africa, except for the Germans hanging out in the middle. But if only one day there could be a war between Britain and Germany that will allow Britain to take complete control of this chain of empire from north to south. That will happen. It's going to be called World War I, and Britain will eventually get to start building their railroad from north to south. All right, good? Good. We want to recognize that not all empires or not all imperial holdings are created or treated the same. You've got different categories of holdings. Most of these holdings are going to end up being known as what are called tropical dependencies. Areas of the world that tend to be around the tropics that will be completely dependent on their European mother country. We tend to see in these tropical dependencies, whether they're in Asia or in Africa or in Pacific Islands, we see in these tropical dependencies large native populations that are dominated by relatively small settler populations. So a few white folks from the mother country dominating massive local populations. Those are tropical dependencies. Then there's settler colonies. The settler colonies are these overseas holdings where the mother country would actually encourage settlement to the colonies or the empire. One good example of one of these settler colonies is Australia. And Australia, which began as a British penal colony, where the British would send prisoners that they didn't want in England anymore. Yes, sir?
You know that Aussies today were called by the British, and some of my British teachers always make fun of their Australian teachers. We call them POMs, P-O-M-E, prisoner of Mother England.
Oh, really? I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
Interesting. So Australia began as a penal colony for the British Empire. But by the 19th century, it's going to develop into a viable settler colony, and more British subjects will start to settle into Australia. And there they will dominate a relatively sparse local population that unfortunately begins to be known as Aboriginals. The Aborigine population in Australia. The Aborigine population in Australia is going to be treated in much the same way that the remaining Native American populations will be treated by the United States or Canada. And that is to say, not very good, and the British are going to attempt to drive out Aboriginal culture in Australia by forcing upon them the British system, the British way of life. Some of these, yes ma'am?
Well, I just heard recently that something called Australia Day was the day that the Brits took over and drove the
Okay.
Aboriginals out, and lots of people were upset about it, especially those who had Aboriginal roots or whatever.
No doubt.
It was this big.
No doubt. Some holdings are going to combine aspects of these tropical dependencies and the white settler colonies. The French in Algeria, for example, the French holding in Algeria, the French will encourage large amounts of French nationals to go and settle into North Africa, to try to turn Algeria into essentially a French state in Africa. But there are still many locals that the French in Algeria have to deal with. Because, for example, what is not going to happen to the native population in places like Algeria or in places like Southeast Asia with the French in Southeast Asia? What is not going to happen to local populations there that will happen to local populations in the Americas?
They won't migrate.
They won't die. They won't die from these diseases. Remember, the old world diseases are not new to people in the old world. So that's not going to impact them. And that's why we're going to see a very different story in American imperialism versus this African or Southeast Asian imperialism. Yes, sir?
And just the way to compare the British compared to the French, the way that when
Yeah.
the British, like they did it slowly, like they didn't exert much power. Like during the French occupation of Vietnam, they did it slowly, as in like they divided the country into 3 distinct regions: in
Yes.
southern, the middle, and the northern, so that the people themselves would be feeling to
Have some
be
local autonomy.
divided, and so that people would so they could treat the others easier. That's
Yes.
why still problems today.
I want to mention New Zealand off the coast of Australia. In New Zealand, we would see a lot of resistance from the local population in New Zealand called the Maori population, M-A-O-R-I. Yeah, the Maori population in New Zealand who will resist British domination. But this resistance is going to prove to be largely futile by the Maori, and the British will ultimately dominate New Zealand as well. First, people like the Maori populations in New Zealand, these were isolated people, right? These Polynesians were largely isolated from the rest of the world. So old world diseases are going to negatively impact these Polynesian people, unlike they would in Southeast Asia or in Africa. So the Maori population will be tremendously harmed because of that, and eventually in conflicts with the British Empire, as the British tried to exert control over New Zealand, many Maori would fall and they would have their culture forcibly removed from them, from the British rule. One last category of imperialism that we're going to see in the 19th century, we're going to categorize as economic imperialism. And here we look at China. Now, China has got a long and powerful history of dynasty and empire themselves, right? And China is another one of these places that European powers were not able to enter into to dominate in the 1700s. In fact, by the 1800s, European trade is really relegated to one city in southern China called Canton. But the British are going to try to expand that influence in China, because in China they see the 2 keys to the Industrial Revolution. They see resources that can be exploited. China is going to have natural resources unparalleled, and then markets to sell finished products in. China's got, even in the 19th century, the biggest population in the world. So China is the prize in every European empire's eye. So the British are going to attempt to expand their control and influence in China. This comes through the importation of a drug called opium. It's in the same drug family as heroin. So every horror story that you guys have read about what heroin can do to people, opium was doing it to people in the 19th century. The British produced a lot of opium, particularly in South Asia, like in Afghanistan. The British produced a lot of opium, and they would take that opium to China for sale. And this began in the late 1700s. Yes, ma'am?
Where was it produced?
In Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, northern India. And the British would import this opium into China. And by the early 1800s, the Chinese government began to recognize what a disaster opium was for the Chinese people. Here we have a picture of what's known as an opium den. It's just a house that people would go to, and they would smoke the opium, and they would start to look like this. You can see why a government might find this problematic. Are these going to be functioning members of the Chinese society? Absolutely not. So in 1838, with a recognition of the destructive nature of opium on the Chinese dynasty, the Qing Empire will ban the importation of opium into China. And they will move to seize opium stores in southern China, like storehouses for opium. They will seize them from the British. They will destroy them, and they will ban the future importation of opium. Well, this was a big moneymaker for Britain, right? Britain was trading opium in China for the luxuries of China, for the silks and the porcelains. Well, if China's going to stop the importation of opium, what would Britain have to trade with? Money. They don't want to do that. So they'd rather trade with the opium. So Britain is going to say to China, China, it is now the mid-19th century. We have quite an impressive navy. You are going to open up your trade to us. China won't be able to resist. China won't be able to resist. China won't be able to resist that trade because the British Navy is going to enter into the rivers of China. And they're going to forcibly open trade with China through a war known as the Opium War. This is from 1839 to 1842. This is the first Opium War, where British warships will essentially force China into what are known as a series of unequal treaties. In 1842, the Chinese are forced to sign what's known as the Treaty of Nanjing, which is the first of a series of unequal treaties between European powers and the Chinese Qing dynasty. The Treaty of Nanjing, Nanjing, where Britain and later other European powers will get unparalleled access to Chinese markets and will again be able to sell the opium in China. Now, they're not going to take over China outright. China still has hundreds of millions of people. That can't be done. But they will force their trade upon China. In 1843, Britain is going to take control of Hong Kong. And it will become a crown possession of the British Empire. And it will be the first British colony in China. China is going to be forced to allow Christian missionaries into their country. Essentially, China can't stop the British from doing whatever the British want to do now. And other European nations will follow. Eventually, we see images like this sprouting up, where you've got the Qing dynasty in China protesting European powers, whether it be the British, here's Queen Victoria, or the Germans, or the Italians, or the French, or even the Japanese looking into China, looking to dominate that state. And the Chinese won't be able to stop them at all. Yes, ma'am?
But if China has a lot of people and they're like really like kind of like have a lot of
Fiction
information, how
of,
are they so like how can they like British take over them?
They're not letting the British take over. The British aren't taking over China. They're sailing up the rivers of China. And they're taking their gunships, their heavy gunships, the steam-powered gunships, up the rivers of China. And they are unleashing on the cities of China. They're not getting off the boats. They're not getting off the boats. They're not moving to stick their flag into China and take over China outright. That would be hard, and you would need a big population to do that. You need a lot of soldiers to do that. They're just blowing up the cities on the coasts and forcing the Chinese government to relent, because every major city in China is ultimately on a river, right? And so the British are just forcing those cities to capitulate. Another connection to economic imperialism that we've already briefly mentioned is the United States and Hawaii. Remember, it was largely one part American military interests in Hawaii, but another part was corporations like the Dole Fruit Company, the Dole Pineapple Company in Hawaii, that called for American involvement in the Hawaiian Islands that would give better business conditions for American industry in Hawaii. By 1898, the United States would formally take over the Hawaiian Islands. Questions, comments, concerns?